I'm joined today by Greg Eghigian, who is the author of After the Flying Saucers Came, a very good book, uh, which looks at the UFO phenomenon from a global perspective. Do you see many parallels between the airship mystery of the late 19th century and early 20th century and the current scare over Chinese balloons in terms of kind of how people and the media respond to it? And do you think that this demonstrates that the UFO mythos is inextricably tied to an atmosphere of anxiety and threat?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two elements there that I'd want to tease out. One is, as you hint at there, the importance of the media, right? Media in both instances has played an absolutely central role, and of course it played a central role in the entire UFO phenomenon. I would go so far as to say you would not have the phenomenon be what it is without the media's involvement in the way that it tried to saw this as a compelling story, promoted the story, but also then also gave voice to people, right? Gave a platform for certain people to sort of express their views and have it distributed widely. So the media element, I think, is the one element that's common. Now, the difference between, I would say, the airship mystery and the airship scares of the late 19th and early 20th century, especially the ones of the 19th century, that's different, of course, from today's situation. And you mentioned the famous case of the Chinese balloon. What was that? A few years back, a year back or so, is of course back in the 19th century, while there were balloons, right, that had been around since the 18th century, there had still been nobody who had invented the steerable, right, the manageable balloon, the dirigible. The Zeppelin is going to have to wait a few more years. You still don't have airplanes at this point of time. So in a sense, we can be pretty convinced that given the descriptions of what people were seeing, that these were things that were probably in all likelihood not anything real. These were probably, right, things that were generated by the media and a media circus. That's of course not the case with more the present conversations, because we know there are actually things being seen. The question always is what, though we suspect, right, a lot of them are drones and things like that. The third element that you brought up is this question of anxiety, right? Are these things fueled by fear and, and paranoia, if you will? My argument in the book is that is certainly relevant to it. You don't have the UFO phenomenon as we know it without the paranoia that was associated with the Cold War. And really also, by the way, something that often gets neglected, the sense of fear and anxiety derived from the fallout of the Second World War, right? The fact that the Second World War was not a faded, distant memory for people in the late 40s and early 50s. It was a very, very palpable thing. But I make the argument in the book, though, that is not enough to understand the phenomenon, because the other side of this is that it was also fueled, and I think today it is as well, fueled by a lot of people who see in UFOs, or UAP as they're called today, see in it something that is a form of technological marvel, right? And it's the same thing with the airship scare of the 19th century. This fascination, this excitement, this enthusiasm about invention, about creating new technologies that are unprecedented. This kind of futuristic vision of the world. It's not a surprise to me that among the people who have been most excited about UAP today are people who also have ties to Silicon Valley and the tech industry, right? That connection has always been there, right? Engineers have, for instance, played a huge role in ufology, right? So I think there's this two sides to the phenomenon. Yes, anxiousness, anxiety, fear, but on the other hand, excitement and enthusiasm.
You quote Morris Jessup, and you provide a list of ideas about whether people thought flying, like where they thought flying saucers were coming from, right? So, are you aware of any concerted effort to track the relative frequencies of these ideas through time? So, like, what would you say is the leading hypothesis these days among like UFO, UAP believers and advocates, and the mass of these believers versus like the thought leaders in the area?
Yeah. Yeah. My sense with what that I'm getting from a lot of the people I think that's a good description of them, thought leaders within the UFO world. A lot of them, right, would not call themselves ufologists, right? They have different names for them now. But I think the most common view is if you notice, the invocation these days is of non-human intelligence, this NHI has replaced the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And from what I gather when I talk to people, but when I hear a lot of them speak publicly as well, that there is a belief that there is a likelihood of them being something that is not necessarily extraterrestrial, that they are, as I've heard people say to me, they've been here all along, is the idea. Now who they are is not very clear to them. They think about it. I've heard people bring up this concept of the ultra terrestrial, right? Um, what's interesting to me, and probably to you as well, as somebody I'm sure who knows the history of UFOs, a lot of them use this phrase ultra terrestrials and say, oh, yeah, it was developed in the last few years. And of course, we know the ultra terrestrial term and concept goes back to at least John Keel, maybe even precedes John Keel in the 70s. But so that it to me is probably the most prominent thing I'm hearing, that there is a suspicion that these things are not extraterrestrial, but they come from some other life forms that actually inhabit the earth in some other way or walk among us in some other ways. The other one that I hear that is very common is the suspicion that this is a form of artificial intelligence. Who created it, where it came from, they're not clear on, but artificial intelligence is another. And the third one I've heard when I talk to somebody who has ties to the Silicon Valley community, told me, he said that his experience talking with young people, right? 20-year-olds and younger, that they tend to be attracted mostly to the idea from, if you remember the movie The Matrix, this idea that basically our reality is actually some sort of dreamlike reality. It's a false reality that really what we are is we are the imaginings or the concoctions in the minds of of some other beings or beings who aren't here or another alternative dimension, right? This kind of stuff. He says, so young people tend to be really kind of attracted to that. Maybe it's not a surprise given the influence of the Matrix on a lot of people. So those are probably the three that I hear most often these days.
Right. But do you perceive a sort of in terms of the relative frequencies of positions that people hold, would you say that it differs? There's a kind of disconnect, or yeah, like between the thought leaders and the sort of general public, or lay people who believe in UFO.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point because I think there is kind of a disconnect because I think the thought leaders that you describe that when they've been pushed on the issue or they talk in certain environments, I think what they do is they tend to embrace these more elaborate speculative ideas. I think that all the surveys seem to indicate that the general public, and this is the general public probably across most of the world, when they do believe that these things are real, they tend to fall into one of two categories. Either they believe they're pretty prosaic, mundane things. They are the creation of, the Chinese or the Russian or the American government or corporations or, their drones, things like that. Or they believe they are extraterrestrial. The thing I think we see with the general public is they tend to be mostly drawn to the idea that there's some sort of very concrete material, nature to these phenomenon, right? That these are real, actual crafts, right? And that they were invented by somebody, either here on Earth or by extraterrestrials. What I get a sense with the thought leaders, as you describe them, I think there is somewhat of a disconnect in that I think a lot of them are drawn to, as I say, these other kinds of more elaborate speculations.
In your view, is there kind of a inherent tendency, or at least like an implicit possibility, towards extremism and zealotry in ufology? So, like, are there also any countervailing tendencies that would sort of return people to more moderate positions?
Mm. Yeah, so it does seem to me that historically, when you look at ufology and you look at people who have been drawn to this topic, there is this element to it that is a kind of I've heard this so many times. I've heard this from journalists, for instance, who are studying this stuff. There is this kind of way in which you are drawn into rabbit holes. You're drawn to certain kinds of analysis that leads you to another layer. And because there's this sense that every layer, every point and stage you reach in your investigation or analysis leaves you unsatisfied, you look for the next one and you say, aha, I wonder if I'm neglecting this, or I wonder if that person with that idea was sort of maybe right, and now I've got to explore. And you mentioned Morris Jessup before, right? The American ufologist who was, one of the earliest ones. This is a point that he himself made already back in the 1950s, was this sense of constantly seeking an answer to something, being kind of unsatisfied with it. So doubling down, keep on going, keep on going. And I think that to me, when I read the sources, that to me is where what you describe as the zealotry comes in. It's this phenomenon. You see this, for instance, in the movement called the disclosure movement, the people who are seeking, governments to come clean. There is this sense that there's no end point to that game. There will never be a way in which governments will satisfy folks until they come and say, right, you were right all along. And even then, I don't think it would be enough for many people. So the question, I think the second part of the question you ask is, of course, how is that moderated? And is that, what are the ways in which those kinds of views or approaches get moderated? And it does strike me that it is one of the things I think that a lot of journalists, when I talk to them, aren't aware of, is that there have always been, and I know you know this as well, there have always been lots of people doing UFO research, and particularly in Europe, right? Whose views on this subject are, I don't hold out any hope that these things are extraterrestrial, or they believe at the very least that's kind of the last place I'm going to go, right? That in fact they are interested in the subject for a variety of other reasons, right? And that has always been the case, that there's plenty of people who have been active, as you well know, and people we know in Spain. I think of people like Eduardo Russo in Italy. I think about people in Germany and in France as well. But of course, there's also been Americans whose views on the subject are simply that I'm here to look at this phenomenon as a really interesting subject, right? I'm fascinated with what things are, what people see. what they think about the phenomenon. But in the end, my own view is I approach it as a kind of a skeptic ufologist. So I think there are plenty of people historically who've been in the communities, in these communities, who've kind of sat there and said, now hold it, hold it, hold it. Let's take this one step at a time. And I think that's where the moderation has come in.
Hmm. And you mentioned Germany, like in West Germany especially, and also in Sweden. I guess in the 1970s, there was a lot of young people who sort of felt a little bit alienated from the more established ufologists, and you talk about this in your book. That sort of fragmentation, do you think that that could be a countervailing tendency towards extremism?
That's an interesting idea. I mean, it certainly was in the 1970s. I mean, that's a really good point because you're quite right. In the 70s, a lot of those young people came in and felt like, you know, you old, and again, this is a familiar story in history. Young people coming along saying, "You older people, you've had your shot. You haven't done a good job. Either you're a little ham-fisted about this, or I think you're going down the wrong path." And so, yeah, you're right. Younger people came on board, and some of them, as you observe, I talk about in my book, came to it and said, it's time we approach this maybe a little more scientifically than a lot of you are doing. That said, I'm not sure I think inherently that an influx of young people is the key to sort of introducing moderating influences over time. We know that historically, and surveys show this even today, younger people have traditionally been more open to the speculative aspects of UFOs than older people. And in that regard, they therefore, as I pointed out earlier, have also been more open to a variety of speculation about this. So we know they are people, younger people also are, or in this regard, are also more open to maybe the more spiritual, the more religious dimensions of the UFO phenomenon. So they seem to me to represent always a voice that counterbalances whatever trends are going on, but a lot of them are also people who are ready to join in the fight or join the campaign, whatever that might be in any given situation.
Yep. And speaking of like these sort of esoteric ideas that a lot of people hang on to, what do you think are the influences that theosophy still has on ufology into the present day?
That's a good question. It, when I theosophy is and was right, of course, this highly influential, albeit in very specific sort of communities of people in the 19th and throughout the good part of the 20th century, on not just simply the UFO phenomenon as it's going to play out, but of course, as you know, also on just occult belief in general in the Western world. Um, but the thing about theosophy is that I don't know that I get a sense that anybody today who speaks on this subject or who's drawn to the sort of esoteric dimensions of UFOs, I don't know that many of them, for instance, are well read in theosophy. I think any influences are probably indirect, which is not a surprise that that happens as in a lot of other settings. I think probably the more direct impact is coming from that philosophical and spiritual movement of New Age philosophy. And again, New Age philosophy, like theosophy, was kind of open-ended. It was, and especially New Age has never been sort of one thing only, and it doesn't have, kind of canonical readings you have to command, right? Rather, it's been a kind of an ethos, a kind of a mindset. And I think that's been very impactful today on a lot of people who are looking at the phenomenon.
Hmm. And still linked to theosophy, the Californian subculture. Do you think that the contactee movement could have happened without the Californian subculture?
Oh, that's a really, really interesting argument, right? Yeah. What I would agree with you on is I don't know that a lot of these things could have happened without the kind of Californian, or maybe if we want to broaden it, the Southwestern United States kind of culture. I recently gave a talk in the Dallas-Fort Worth area on how the American Southwest taught the world how to think about UFOs. And my argument there was that was one of the elements, was that the American Southwest, its landscape, but also the idea of how much of that landscape has been associated with certain mentalities and philosophies, of course, not just with white colonials, but of course, indigenous people as well, and how that has been reflected in a whole wide array of different values and ideas that I guess would probably fall under the rubric of alternative, right? Alternative religions, alternative spiritualities, alternatives to the conventional mainstream religious communities. And there's no question the contactees who are going to be probably the most vocal, are going to be people who are coming out of that world and linked to that world. Some of them, like George Adamski, clearly influenced by all this stuff and are part of that. Others who are probably more indirectly influenced by it, like Truman Bethurum and Daniel Fry, right? Orfeo Angelucci, people like that. But you're quite right that whole kind of culture and then subculture of alternative spirituality, and personal growth ethos, that stuff plays a really central role in the contactee movement. And it needs to be said that they return the favor, right? The contactees also, in a sense, help advance those kinds of values in the American Southwest as well.
Hmm. And you also talk about how UFOs or musings about ETs kind of acted as a replacement in many cases for traditional religion. But they also talked a lot about God, didn't they, the contactees? And so, to what extent do you think that they were really reaffirming God in an increasingly secular era?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I agree with you. Of course, this in some sense that's the argument in part of that famous book that I think is still one of the best books written on the subject by Carl Jung, right, in 1958 on flying saucers, who makes a similar kind of point. Yeah, there's no question that the contactees very often invoke God, but not just any God. It's very clear that most of them are invoking a Christian God. I mean, some of them even specifically invoke Jesus Christ, right? So a lot of their thinking about religion and spirituality marries and weds this kind of New Age philosophy with fairly established and baseline Christianity at the time as well. So a lot of them do that. Moreover, what you see constantly, I think, invoked in so many of the contactee stories is essentially a story of salvation and redemption, which is the common Christian narrative, right? It's about being saved by God. It's by being saved by these extraterrestrial superhumans who are here to redeem us from ourselves, right? And so, in that sense, they, as you say, they fill in something that maybe some people felt was missing into this new kind of philosophy that really weds the old with the new.
Hmm. And could the power of the contactee message have been as strong as it was if like the beings were non-human looking aliens?
That would have been that it's an interesting counterfactual, right? Because if the beings who they had seen had looked like the beans that we're all familiar with now, right? After Whitley Strieber. It's I think it's fair to ask the question, would the whole contact phenomenon played out the same? Was it essential that what they described as these beings looked not only like us, right, but they kind of looked better than us. They were radiant. They were beautiful. They're described as almost angelic looking, right? Do you need that kind of angelic vision of them in order for that to be successful? It's hard to say in the end, right? But I think it's fair to at least consider the possibility that that is at least one of the keys to why or how their message could be successful in some circles, right?
Hmm. And you also talk about the little people, which is more like the more sinister sort of parallel stream that was going on. Do you think that that could have been informed, or maybe that's the wrong word, but tinged with fears of like the Chinese, the Yellow Horde, and communist takeover um, by the Chinese, or sort of racial motifs of the enemy?
Yeah. So you raise a really interesting question because what's been common and what's been discussed I know at least since the 70s, and maybe there were others discussing this even before them, but certainly since the 1970s. UFO researchers, people interested in the paranormal, have very often discussed and talked about this idea that the little people, right, the little men that are described so much in a lot of the literature at that time, was really another variation of fairies and elves, right? Things like this that it really sprites these kinds of figures, maybe even demons of some kind, right? And that's a very common thing. What you just mentioned here is something that I flag in my book several times, as you point out, is how often they're described using racial motifs, how often they're talked about looking Asian, speaking Chinese, yellow skinned, sometimes dark skinned. I must admit, when I was reading this, I was quite surprised by how often racial stereotypes were talked about and invoked in all of this. So I think your observation that some of this was gesturing towards stereotypes about communists, and particularly, as you point out, the Chinese. I don't think that's entirely far-fetched. I think, again, you don't hear them say that. I've never seen anything in which anybody suspects that that's the case. But that idea that stereotype is in people's minds is very clearly there.
And maybe I'll wrap it up with a final question.
Mhm.
What was the most toxic forum for UFO discussion before the advent of Twitter?
The most toxic.
Yeah, the most nasty, the sort of most vindictive, and people sort of get into shouting matches and all that sort of thing.
Oh gosh. Yeah, well, there were of course these online forums, right?
Hmm.
That existed before Twitter existed for a lot of these things. I would even go farther back, in some ways, because those online forums that were out there could get that way. But one of the things I argue in the book, and I've discuss this with journalists who, they're clearly interested in online forums. They're interested as you point out, the sort of the toxic nature of rumor mongering and misinformation that circulates in social media. And I kind of make the argument that everyone thinks that this didn't exist before social media or the internet. And it did exist, right? I mean, people had, these organization and groups had newsletters and news bulletins, and some of them had even magazines and things like that they utilized that were, forums and venues for them to put forward their ideas, but also to pick apart people, right? And to go after the people they didn't like. Probably the one that's talked about a lot back in the day was sort of some of the stuff that James Mosley had with saucer schmear and other things. Though I will say those, I think some people didn't like it. Some people saw the kind of commentary made in that context as maybe not nice. A lot of it was just joking around. A lot of it was meant to be just, kind of just funny and having a good time. And I would also make the point that you see it on the other side with some of the debunkers, Philip Klass in his newsletter, The Famous Skeptic, could get quite nasty. He knew it. He didn't mind. He said, that's my job. But certainly alienated a lot of people back in the day with his newsletters. So I think a lot of these things, that kind of dimension existed. What's of course different, and I think maybe this is what you're hinting at as well, is that the speed with which one can communicate these things now is so different than it was back in the day, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the digital environment's really, and the particular features of Twitter as well, like the concision with which you have to make a message. So that sort of a lot of nuance gets cut out, and then it sort of devolves into shouting matches and whatnot.
Right.
And
No, you're spot on about it. Yeah, it doesn't, because of the limitations of words. What can you say? I've often thought that Twitter sometimes seems to me not altogether different than, say, bumper stickers on a car, right? You can't say very much substantively in that regard.
yes. Well, Greg, thank you very much. I think I'll wrap it up there, actually. I think those are the
Okay.
questions I had. I'll put your resources in the description to this video. And any parting message you want to convey?
No, I mean, I want to thank you for the interview. This was fascinating. You asked in some of the most original questions I've ever been asked about this, and you gave me room to think about things. So I'm really glad we had this chance to chat. And yeah, I hope people have a chance to read the book and they find it intriguing.